Thank you very much, Madam Presiding Officer. Let me begin by wishing all my colleagues, many of whom I have not seen in person, for the year 2020, a happy new year. Let me also extend New Year wishes for you as well, Madam Presiding Officer, and of course to the entire island of Tobago and by extension our brothers and sisters in Trinidad. 2020 hopefully will be a prosperous year for all of us, a year in which we will have good health, which will mean a reduction in the numbers of expenditure for healthcare, because we will all be healthy and happy, and we pray above all things else that God will guide Tobago throughout this year 2020. Today I wish to put before this House a motion that I think is extremely important for our discussions today. In fact, if we should do a poll of Tobagonians and we should poll what are some of their most pressing concerns, I believe that this will perhaps be in the top 5 of those pressing concerns of every Tobagonian. The motion reads, whereas it is a widely held perception that the cost of living in Tobago is generally higher than that of Trinidad, and whereas there is no recent study to examine the current cost of living differentials between both islands, and whereas some Tobagonians attempt to circumvent the high costs of goods and services by going to Trinidad to shop, and whereas the Supermarkets Association of Trinidad and Tobago warned in a statement dated January 4th, 2020, that there will be price increases as suppliers have increased their prices, and whereas the duties and consumption taxes attached to goods and services exacerbate the problem for residents and even make tourism and other products and services on the island less competitive, be it resolved that this House asks the Executive Council to commission an extensive study on the cost of living differentials between both islands and the merits of duty-free and/or tax-free initiatives for the island, and be it further resolved that the report of this study be laid in this House and that this study be used to inform policy initiatives to treat with the economic realities of Tobagonians. Madam Presiding Officer, this term cost of living is really just the level of prices for a range of everyday goods and services. When we are looking at the cost of living, we tend to look at the cost of food, the cost of housing, in particular rent, or even mortgage payments. We look at the cost of utilities. We look at the cost of transportation, the cost of clothing, the cost for building materials via the hardware. We look at cost of furniture, cost of clothing, cost of education. In other words, what does it cost us to live in Tobago? If we are to put in dollars and cents a value for living in Tobago, what does it cost us? Now, of course, the optimistic Tobagonian will say, well, since Tobago is the closest thing to heaven, then no price is too high for living in Tobago. But the reality is, all of our people are not rich, are not wealthy. And so we have to consider the cost of living in Tobago for all of our people. What does it cost us to live on this island? In the motion, I started off by saying that it is a widely held perception that the cost of living in Tobago is greater than that of Trinidad. And I'm saying, using the word perception, because I am aware that there are some things that are cheaper in Tobago than in Trinidad. There are some things that carry the same prices in Tobago as in Trinidad. But I'm also aware that there are many things that are cheaper in Trinidad than Tobago. And that's why the motion also acknowledges that several Tobagonians from time to time will find themselves going down on the boat to buy goods and even services and then come back to Tobago. We see them all the time. We bounce upon them in Price Mart. We see them getting hardware supplies because there's this perception that if I go to Trinidad to purchase these items, I will get a better bang for my buck. But are they wrong? And in many cases, I believe that they are right. The areas where the costs are the same, those areas tend to be areas where there are government subsidies or where there are standardized prices across the country. So for example, the price for gasoline at the pump is the same. Unlike some states, including federal states where prices will vary from pump to pump, in Trinidad and Tobago, the price is more or less the same across the board. And that happens in areas, Madam Presiding Officer, where there are government subsidies applied or where there is a standardized price structure for that particular item. There are other areas, a few other areas where the goods are actually cheaper in Tobago than in Trinidad. For example, the price of fish. And I was alarmed to learn that if I am to go to Trinidad to buy a piece of kingfish, I will have to pay close to $100 for a pound. And the regular, ordinary, everyday fish that we sometimes turn our backs on, at least where I live, the albacore and so on, is as high as $50 a pound. And I got that from NAMDEVCO's National Agricultural Market Information Systems. That's the prices that they have for wholesale, not even for retail. But almost every day when I hear the conch shell blowing outside my house, and it's a signal that there's fish at the bay, and I go there, I will get the ordinary fish, albacore, and I'll even get kingfish for $20 a pound. And I'll get what we call in Speyside bankfish, that's your redfish and your grouper and so on, for $25 a pound. If I go to neighboring Charlottesville, the price isn't much different. It's $20 for the albacore and so on, and kingfish and the bankfish is $25. If I come down to Pigeon Point side, the price also isn't much different. I'm told that I could get shark for $15. Well, I don't eat shark, so that doesn't apply to me. But shark for $15, and you could get fish between that $15 and $25 price range. The point I'm making is that there are some goods and services on the island of Tobago that are cheaper than in Trinidad. And what accounts for that might be the fact that it is a primary industry, or that we have some production source locally, and so we can produce it at a cheaper price. But there are many things that are more expensive in Tobago than in Trinidad. And of course, the reasons for the cost of living in Tobago being more expensive than Trinidad will vary. It isn't just because our businessmen are all wicked and that they're all price gouging. It varies. So for example, if we look at transportation, I can take the 29-kilometer journey from Arima to Port of Spain and pay $8. But if I go 13 kilometers from Scarborough to Crown Point, it's $10. I can go from San Fernando to Port of Spain, which is 51 kilometers, for $15. But Speyside to Scarborough, which is a little more than, which is about half of that, 25 kilometers thereabout, I pay $14, $1 less. So transportation is higher. What accounts for that? Well, it's not just that the maximum and drivers are wicked, but we also have this thing called economies of scale. And while in Trinidad there are tons more people, a lot more people to move from point A to point B, and you also have a lot more maxis, or you have a larger competitive pool for transportation. In Tobago we don't. And so that affects the cost of living insofar as transportation. In trying to research for this motion, I went to the Department of Planning to find out what information they do have, if they have any at all. Because I would have framed and reframed this motion, trying to take in account that we may actually have some information on the ground. What I got from planning was a study done in 2009, and I was told that previous to that, a study was done in 2004. And in this 2009 study, it indicated that for vegetables at the Scarborough market, that was up to 75% higher, than Trinidad. But of course, this is not a recent study. This is 2009. This is a decade ago. And maybe things could have changed for the better or for the worst. Either or. Building materials at the time was 46.23%. But this is 2009. But there is no argument, generally, from my observation, and for those of us who still go to the supermarket and actually purchase our own groceries. And I am a bachelor now, so when in the past I wouldn't have to purchase groceries for myself, I must now purchase groceries for the household. And it will appear as if the costs of food items in Tobago generally are more expensive than Trinidad. Again, some will opine that that's the result of the transportation costs being added to the operating costs and that being passed on to the consumer. And so we pay a higher price for goods at the supermarket. But I was particularly intrigued by what I saw happening with the hardware sector. And what I did is that I sent quotations to 3 hardwares for the purpose of building a 30 by 20 foundation. So we're looking at a very small property, 30 by 20 foundation. I got an estimate from a builder in the village, and I sent it to 3 hardwares. I sent it to Dave and Daughters, which is a hardware located right in Speyside. I sent it to Almando's Hardware, which is one located in Scarborough. And I sent it to another one called Claxton Bay Hardware Limited. And the reason why I chose Claxton Bay Hardware Limited is because I recognize that several of my villagers have been patronizing this hardware, and they have been delivering the goods to Speyside by their property. So I said, this is interesting. Let me see if there is some merit behind that. And when I look at the cost comparatively for a 30 by 20 feet property, Claxton Bay Hardware, inclusive of transporting the materials from Trinidad, from Claxton Bay to Speyside, was $18,015. Almando's Hardware was 22.5% higher at $22,068.37. And Dave and Daughters Hardware was 18.6% higher at $21,365.79. So my country hardware cheaper than the one in town, which is not always the case for all goods and services, because when you live in the countryside, you know, sometimes those folks with a little parlor and so on does hit you with some inflationary prices that you have no choice but to pay, because they have sometimes a monopoly on the market, or that might be the only parlor in the village that have that one product that you want. So where you go? You go buy. You have to buy it. But in this case, we are seeing for hardware, supplies and materials being approximately on average 20% higher than in Trinidad, just from this very small research that I did. And what this says is that if I have $100,000 to put towards building a small property, if I have to get those materials, it's better I go to Claxton Bay Hardware. Because what I will get for $100,000 from Claxton Bay Hardware in Trinidad, I will have to pay 120,000 on average in Tobago. So that is higher. And so there are merits to the conversation about the cost of living in Tobago being higher than in Trinidad. So what do we do? Because in addition to the cost of living generally being higher in Tobago than in Trinidad, we must factor in the reality that on top of that, we will have the consumption tax of 12.5%. On top of that, you will have duties, so whatever you import, and all of those things are added to the price. And in the resolution of the motion, two things are proposed. The first thing is that we conduct a study. And the reason why I'm saying we should conduct a study is because if we have to come up with the best solution to the problem, then we have to sit down and study it. I even tried reaching out to the CSO to get some statistics. And up to this morning, I'm still waiting on the data from them. Because they told me, yes, we do collect data on prices on both islands because we needed to calculate inflation and so on. But I haven't received it as yet. And that speaks volumes about why for us in Tobago, in a very autonomous way, we must begin, well, we do it in some regard, but we must, in all regards, collect data, do the research that's necessary, and stockpile the data. This is information that I should be able to get readily at planning if I ask them. Perhaps we should consider having a database that I could plug into and just have access to the research information. Because it's not just politicians who will require this kind of data. You will have social scientists who from time to time will want this data. You will have business people who will want this data, those in the banking sector who will want this data. And so having data is an imperative. And that's why we must conduct our own study, an extensive study, on the cost of living differentials between both islands. But while we are doing that, I felt it important for us to also take the time out to see if there is any merit in having duty-free and or tax-free initiatives for the island. Because as I was toying with this, one economist said to me, well, we should make Tobago tax-free. We remove all taxes. And I thought I was socialist until I heard that opinion. And I said, Farley, you're not that socialist. I don't see how we could operate with zero taxes, especially for an island that is desirous of becoming more autonomous. And then some folks say, well, we should have duty-free zones. And I've asked my colleague, Councillor Faith B. Israel, Dr. Faith B. Israel, to look specifically at the benefits, the merits somewhat of duty-free zones and how that could be implemented given what our laws are saying in Trinidad and Tobago. But some people believe we should have duty-free zones outside of our ports, where people can shop, and if you have your passport, quite like we see in Barbados, you can go into the shopping districts and shop duty-free. But these duty-free zones, as we see modeled across the Caribbean, they don't really benefit the locals. They benefit the visitor. But more than that, they benefit those who provide tourism services. Because we have had that cry from those in the tourism sector, some of whom have been saying, well, the cost of alcohol to us in Tobago for our restaurants and our hotels is significantly more than the cost to those operating in Latin America. And so when we compare, it's much more difficult for us to give a better package and better offerings to our guests than those in Latin America. And that's some of the complaints you hear from them, especially when you ask them, but why can I take the same money I am spending for a weekend at your hotel and fly out of the country and spend a weekend all-inclusive? Why is your price that equivalent? And that's the excuse they will give. And so this whole question of the cost of living does not just impact those of us who live on the island, but it impacts those of us who are in the tourism sector and who want to offer services to those visiting our shores. Because chances are we'll be offering those services at a higher cost if it is we have to purchase the materials at a higher cost in Tobago. And the motion also resolves that we should lay this study in the House, and that we should use this study to inform policy initiatives to treat with the economic realities of Tobagonians. And I did speak about some people wanting to have tax-free measures for the island. And I also found that to be problematic. Because if it is, because say, for example, Tobago would pay less than 12.5% VAT, but that will certainly cause some friction. That could even engender a black market that we don't want. And so perhaps a better policy might be for us to increase the wages of Tobagonians. But then that too comes with higher cost on our recurrent expenditure. So the ultimate question is, what are the policy measures that can work? And that's why this study will look at the merits and the demerits of tax-free initiatives and duty-free initiatives, along with looking at what is the actual cost of living differential at this present moment. And perhaps it will urge us to pay more attention, to increasing local production, because we have realized that in some areas where it's a primary industry and where there is a production on the island, we can have some of the goods and services at a cheaper cost. Maybe we should look into warehouse development. Maybe we should look at port development, and I know that's something that we have been talking about for a while. People previous to this administration spoke about it. Folks in this administration spoke about it, about Tobago having a port as a way of cutting out the middleman. Because Trinidad and Tobago as a whole, we import most of our goods from outside of the country, and especially from the metropolitan states in the country, particularly the United States. And so they import it to Trinidad, there are duties attached to that, and then we must take it from Trinidad, transport it to Tobago, there's a cost attached to that, and then of course, the businessman must say, I have to put something on it for myself. I have also found that another contributing factor to the high cost of living is that many of our business people, either they don't know how to do pricing, or they choose not to do good pricing. Notice I'm not calling them wicked. And the reason why I'm saying that is, if I bring a bale of rice via the ferry to Tobago, there's no reason why I have to attach the same transportation cost on every single bag of rice in that bale. There's no reason. And if on the truck there is rice, flour, sugar, meats, drinks, then I could pay for that transportation cost once and allow the prices of the other goods to be reasonable. But I have found from my observation that many of our proprietors choose to attach that transportation cost to every single item on their shelf. And so we must bear that cost. And so we need to study our cost of living at the moment, study it carefully and extensively, and then use that to now inform policy. And while we are studying it, we must look at whether or not there are merits or demerits to suggestions of having duty-free zones and or tax-free initiatives. Because Tobagonians have been paying far too much for goods and services on the island. And there is an impact to a high cost of living. There is an impact for households. Because it means then that we will take a much longer time to get to where we need to get to as a family. I have known several households who have been building their homes for donkey years. In fact, if you are a stranger to this island, it will look as though Tobago is experiencing a mass construction boom. But if you are a resident on the island, you will realize that several of these buildings have been at this same point for a while. And I'm not talking about just government buildings, I'm talking generally. across the board. I'm talking including people building private homes. People have been building, and not nearing completion for a while. It's not uncommon to find families in Tobago who 5, 10 years, they're building bit by bit. And then another thing layer that adds to that is the issue of the land titles. And so if it is you can't go to the bank because you don't have proper title for your land, you can't go to the bank to get a mortgage, it means you must bill out of pocket, or whenever you get a back pay, you build up a little piece and then you wait again, you take a small loan, you build a piece, when you pay that off, you take a next small loan, and so we keep going. And so there is a cost to all of this. There is a cost to family. When it is, I see some Tobagonians saying, well, I go in Princestown. I'm saying, well, why are you going quite Princestown? I find Princestown is such a far drive and so cumbersome to get to. But people go in Princestown to buy work clothes, to buy school stuff. And I'm saying, well, what about here? It's cheaper there. And as I'm saying, there are some merits to that. As I've shown with the hardware, as we see when we go to shop for clothing, and so on, that some of the things are more expensive here, plenty of the things are more expensive here than there. We also have to look at the fact that if it is the cost of living is higher in Tobago, it means that we individually have less money to invest in innovation and in anything else. So if it is my dream is to become a fashion designer and to invest in that, with the cost of living, what you are left to save is far less, and so it will take the average Tobagonian a longer time to get to that place. And so this motion, Madam Presiding Officer, really is asking us to do an extensive study into the cost of living on the island, look at what it costs us to live here in all sectors, not unlike the study I got from planning, which basically looked at what happens with the hardware and the supermarkets and the market. It has to be wider than that. It has to be broader than that. We have to include rent. We have to include transportation. Everything that comprises our living on the island. What does it cost us to live on the island? And after doing that study, we should then use that information to inform us as to whether or not there are merits to the argument for duty-free zones and or tax-free initiatives. And we should use that study to inform general policy of the THA. And that study will not just help the THA, but as I indicated, it will also help those with private enterprise. Because now they have a real sense of what I could peg my business against, what I could get into, how do I shape up, how do I improve. Because, for example, I find it strange that a hardware in Speyside could give me a whole 2.5% less price than Scarborough, but in all 20% less than Trinidad. It means then that something is up, something is fishy. And we could do more, whether it is with consumer affairs, in terms of price management and regulation. We need to do more to manage the cost of living on the island, because there is an impact for families. There is an impact for those of us who live on the island. And who knows, maybe this is the high cost of living may be one of those push factors that pushes people into Trinidad and elsewhere to live. And that's something for us to consider. Even as economists far and wide tell us that we need to increase our population. Perhaps if we manage the cost of living on the island, more people might return and live on the island and give us the economies of scale that we need. Or maybe that is wishful thinking. But we have to explore it. And I hope today, Madam Presiding Officer, that as we hear from the other side, they will be willing to do some of this exploration with me, that they will be willing for us to do that detailed examination of the cost of living on the island and the merits of tax-free and or duty-free measures, and then to bring that study here so that we can inform THA policies and so that the private sector can use it to gauge their own policy management. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer.
Members, the question is, whereas it is a widely held perception that the cost of living